Sorry, thank you very much. Good. Okie dokie. There we go. And let's get started because we've got lots to get through. And really glad to welcome both Alice and Jen. And thank you ever so much for doing this. Really enjoyed our conversations in the run up to this, and lots to share. So I'll get the slides started in just a second, Alice. But just by way of introduction, this Experts at Work webinar is on working well with boards, and it's for members of all three of our networks. And we're recording this session, as I say. And Alice Breeden is also the regional managing partner, CEO and board Europe and Africa at Heidrick and Struggles, and is up in Edinburgh today. Hello to Edinburgh and hello to Alice.
Thank you.
Jen Sundberg is co-chief executive of Board Intelligence. So welcome, Jen, as well. Thanks ever so much for this. And we'll be exploring issues such as, is your agenda the right agenda for the board? What skills and capabilities does your management team need to discharge the board's needs, I beg your pardon? And where does the board end and the MT begin? Often quite a thing in organisations. And perhaps too, if we have time, how can you and the HR team work well with the board, which really is a nice big issue to discuss. I'm sure we will have time for that. We may have a breakout room for this one. We'll see how we go with timings. Either way, we'll have a hard finish at 12 midday. Do send us your questions and suggestions via chat throughout. Always love to see those. And if you're not already on mute, please do pop yourself on mute. That would be much appreciated. For now, Alice and Jen, over to you. Let's get those slides started. Bear with me a second.
Thank you, Richard. Jen, do you want to say anything else by way of introduction, or shall I jump in?
You go for it. Let's get cracking. I'll follow in your wake.
Perfect. So, yeah, thank you very much, Richard, and lovely to see you all. Please do shout, jump in. I know Richard always likes an interactive discussion. Put questions in the chat. Just interrupt as you go. In the absence of any input from you, we're going to crack on, because our plan for this session was to share a little bit of our thinking, some thoughts from my side, also from Jen's side, in terms of this topic, as Richard's teed up for us. Sitting in the CHRO seat, CPO seat, how can you work well with the board? How can you ensure that board is working at its most effective, and it's working with the executive team, as Richard mentioned, in the most effective way possible? So that's our very broad topic, and we've got a few thoughts to share with you to kind of kick things off. So if we jump in, Richard, I'm going to shout at Richard to change the slides. Thank you. Perfect. A tech fail first off. Thank you. So very high level. I mean, I've got maybe, I think, 10 or so pages to share with you. We thought we'd start with that to put some thought into the room and get your reactions and thoughts. First one being, so what is the role of the board? If you're sitting in the CHRO seat, I'm sure you all know this, but and you may have other variations on this too, depending on where you're working, what your governance structure, and what kind of board you're working with or supporting. But a very high level, this is a definition that we use, talking about the words involved supporting and challenge. The board of directors is there to provide support and challenge to the executives and the executive team, and to hold them accountable. And then we typically look at the big topics that the board is focusing on: risk, strategy, succession, and CEO succession. Those are the big topics that are at play and at stake. And clearly, you can see big roles for HR in all of those words. And if we move on to where you were just going, some of the themes that we see shaping boards. So we see that, I think, and Jen and I have had long conversations over various months and years about what's going on in the boardrooms. So I'll kick off and Jen, do jump in. But our research at Heidrick, and my personal experience working with boards, is that this is absolutely true. I'm with a board today where the conversation is about COP, Trump, Rachel Reeves, etc. This is happening. There's so much happening all the time around us. As you sit in the board, this is how it feels. I think there's more at stake. Talking about planetary boundaries in the board I'm just listening to currently. There's more that's uncertain. There's more that's unknown in terms of pandemics and wars, and I don't need to spell these things out. More people want access and influence into the boardroom, whether that's the media, social media, but also stakeholders, communities, as well as clearly employees, suppliers. I think about scope 3. The access and influence has gone up hugely if you think about boardrooms in the last sort of 15, 20 even years, and more is expected of boards. In the work I do on board effectiveness, you do only have 10 people sitting in a room 4 times a year or 6 times a year, whatever it might be, and they are in UK listed governance anyway at the same level of accountability as an executive director for things like climate strategy and performance and impact on the world. So it's a tough place to be, and I think maybe not for this conversation, but I think it's even harder often for listed board members to want to take the seats in the UK given pay rates and so forth. But that's a kind of whole other conversation. Boards are getting more challenged, I think. And then I had a few quotes on the next page, Richard, from some clients that we interviewed around this topic. This is a piece of research I think I've sent around to you, Richard, before, called Age of Impact, we did last year, which is global, with boards and executives, and we asked them what was on their minds. And I always pick on the one in the middle because Colin Hunt is a client of ours. He's the CEO of AIB, Allied Irish Bank. He was talking about, and he's in a finance institution, and he was talking about leading businesses currently being like having a continuous string of black swan events. And he uses the term, wisely, which are, unpredictable, massively dramatic sort of crises happening all the time. And I sometimes do these pages and think, I don't want to be the harbinger of gloom, but to some degree, it is the world we're living in, but obviously lots of good as well. But I think if you're leading, and all of you will know this from your work in the HR space, it's just more and more difficult and unpredictable to be in these seats. So that's a kind of context piece. And Jen, do jump in at any stage. I'll keep going. Yeah, we're talking about where to hand over. But why don't I keep doing my pieces and then pass to you? So then, if I think about boards and how we work with boards, there are sort of 5 elements for an effective board. On the one down, I think. Yeah, after that I was going to touch on today very briefly. So when I think about how HR can work with boards, these are the sort of 5 lenses where we think about an effective board. If I'm a chair, this is what I'm sort of thinking about. If I'm a CEO, this is what I'm thinking about. And I'll go through them sort of high level one by one, but you can see the purpose and the role is sort of, exec and board, how are they working together, who's making decisions, who's got the accountability, where is the work getting done, frankly. The composition and succession is, you'll be very familiar with CEO succession, but also pivotal critical roles, diversity and culture across the whole organisation, and board refreshment. The operating mechanisms, how the board works, papers, synthesis, summaries, clarity, access, information flows, all that good stuff, which sort of is a bit of a proxy for how well the business, in fact, is being, run and led. The culture and dynamics in the board, conversations, openness, trust, honesty, relationships, all those good things that get things done well. And development. So are executives being developed in the way they need to be able to present well at the board? Is the board developing itself, its own learning? Is it seeking out diverse opinions? Are there board effectiveness reviews and board member feedbacks sort of at a practical level happening? So those are the 5 lenses. And then I was going to do a very brief piece on each. So on the purpose and role, and rather than, if you go down one more, Richard, for me, that would be wonderful. Rather than do more definitional pieces on it, I was going to pose a little bit of, or throw in some data or research and findings that we find. This is another piece of research that we've done called the Confidence Monitor, or maybe a board monitor, actually, this one. We were looking at, again, how boards and execs are feeling and how they're working together. And if you look, I think it's a sort of 3rd one down. This finding is that the board typically doesn't trust the executive to get things done and is therefore getting much more operationally involved. And we found that across the world, across every sector, every size, all contexts. And I find it in most of the boards I'm working with, that given the context we've just talked about, the boards are finding it more challenging to understand what's happening, therefore asking more questions, and getting more involved with the operations and execution in the business, which is not quite what the board's there for. So most boards reported that it was too much, it was getting to become a problem, and the reason was that they just weren't sure they knew enough about what the executives are doing to sort of trust that things were going to get done. And then the next piece that we find boards doing on the purpose and role is the role of the board versus the wider organisation. If you go down to the next one, again, I'm I'm based in London. Our work is global and the research here is global. Some of my references are quite London listed sort of context because that's what I'm in, and I'm sure I'm not sure you are all in that context, so apologies for that. But in London listing environment anyway, there has to be a designated non-executive who is representing the workforce and the interests of the workforce. And and in the European boards there are often two workforce representatives on the board. So this other question, when you look at the purpose and role of the board, and you as an HR group, is it at the right level? Are the board engaged effectively or too much in the workforce? And I think the trend that we see here is one again we see globally, that the board members are increasingly engaging with the wider workforce, and workers are kind of demanding more of that as well. And I think CHROs are in a real unique position to help to monitor that, to help to make sure that's at the right place, to make sure the voices are being heard, but there's not too much overstepping going on there, given again the main role of the board that we talked about first. So that's on purpose and role, and we can come back to that maybe if anyone has any questions. Again, do please shout. But the next big topic was composition. And Richard, you touched on this. Clearly, our kind of heartland in the work that we do, and again, important for you all as CHROs. So if you're going to work well with the board, being thoughtful about clearly the competencies you have on the board, whether they are the kind of fundamental ones you need, whether they're ones you need for your strategic success, whether they're sector specific, and whether you need more different diversity, different voices, different tones, styles, areas of expertise in your boardroom. And that's true clearly for board refreshment, also CEO succession, and wider executive planning. I mean, composition is a heartland topic that I'm sure you'll all have thoughts and views on. And then in the next one, Richard, on composition, thinking about where the work gets done and where the right skills are. Again, you'll probably all know this, but the kind of core structure of the board, you have the board meeting, and then you get work done in committees, audit, remuneration and nominations, typical three, but often risk and investment. We also often see governance, sustainability, various other ones that kind of may form a norm around other issues, but those are the core ones. And again, I work with CHROs often to help them think about how to bring their own papers, how to manage their own communications through nominations, through remunerations, which is where CHROs typically interface, and I'm sure you and your teams have been doing work there. We also do work sometimes where we see clients working where the HR director will help executives understand the capabilities they need to present well at the board, to synthesize, to communicate well. So thinking about where the work gets done, what's the right level to bring information for review, for approval, for socializing before a big decision might come around in the next board cycle. You can't bring a huge REM shift in a one-off committee. That needs to be kind of trailed, and case for change, and what's the sequence of those stories you want to tell through the various committees and boards, and where that work is happening. And then the next piece, Richard, if you could, was on wider CEO succession. It's a bit of a difficult page to read, but CEO succession particularly, clearly a huge and important, really the most important role the board kind of can execute, and clearly one of the most important for the CHRO. And again, this is a space we're working increasingly, where we see boards asking for always on views of talent internally and externally. Who would take the role of the CEO if we had an emergency event today? Who could take it in 3 months? Who would be the right person if we had to wait a year, or we wanted to develop internals? So that's a big view role of the board, and where CHROs clearly play another big part. Thinking about how you're doing that, what conversations you're teeing up, how you're using your incumbent CEO to start that conversation, who's typically the most difficult one to engage, who doesn't want to think about their own potential mortality. But obviously, for good governance, needs to be absolutely thought about all the time, probably. And then the next piece we talk about, and I know Jen will pick this up once I've concluded, but the operating mechanisms piece, and I think this is in fact your research, Jen, that I'm quoting here joyfully. But I think Board Intelligence have done some very interesting work, and I do a lot of board review work, so I share this data points that 47% of directors, only 47% get value from board papers. So that's a huge chunk of wasted time and effort on all parties, particularly from all the team members who could be out doing other work, whether it's revenue generation or supporting saving the world, but time that could be spent elsewhere, spent on papers which are not driving to value or decision making or insight or learning or anything. And that, I think, is a huge issue for our boards globally in terms of the way that work happens and gets done. And then the final piece, or nearly at the final piece, culture and dynamics. And again, I know Jen has thoughts on this one too, but we often use this 2 by 2. This is what I call our support and challenge matrix. I'm sure you've seen this in other contexts. It's used, and I've seen it in many places, to do with teams, leadership more broadly, and in boards. But the basic sort of premise is where do you want to be and where are you as you sit around the table having a conversation? How does it feel? Does it feel cozy? So everything's just very nice and jolly and lovely and everything's fine. Does it feel more on the kind of pressured, confrontational side, or is it in fact something that can be dialed up and down depending on what it needs to be, but you get as an executive what you need in terms of support and or challenge from your board members when you need it. And so I've done this actually physically in a room where people have stood around a tube, drawn it on the carpet and said, where do you feel you are? Where would you like to be? And you can just explore. Interesting that the people who joined most recently think it's more cozy, and the people who've been here a long time think it's challenging, or the executives are experiencing a pressured environment, and in fact that's not what everyone else is feeling. The typical boards that I deal with, and I've done 40 or 50 in the last couple of years, have been much more on the cozy side and want to dial up more performance edge. And so we often work, or just small things like getting feedback after each session, thinking about the questions you're asking and making it okay to ask more challenging questions, and just agreeing that in the room in a general way, and then doing that in the actual conversations, and then getting feedback on how did that feel. And just doing some small things like that can often improve the quality of the conversation, which is another big driver of impact, I think, in that meeting, and therefore better decisions, better organizational resource allocation and strategy. Just makes for better outcomes for all of us in our daily lives, hopefully. And then the final piece, which I think I said before, but this one is a development lens, which is just the same sort of story as you'll be doing with all of your stakeholders, giving feedback, receiving feedback, encouraging, the SID to give the chair feedback, the chair to give CEO feedback, CEO to give the team feedback, and for yourself to receive feedback in your HR seat in terms of how you're showing up and your papers are showing up. Just making sure that's all in place and is done in a kind of fair and open way, as it would always be the case in an HR group. I don't need to preach that, I'm sure, in this context. And then I think that was it from my side. I think it was over to Jen.
Sure. Thank you, Alice. That sets out really beautifully the context and the challenge for the boardroom. Actually, if you drop the slides for a sec, I may not use them. Let's see. So I'm Jen Sundberg. I have spent the last 15, actually going on 20 years now, immersed in the subject of board effectiveness, how to help boards work smarter, how to help really tap into the collective brain power of those directors around the table. But as with all things in life, the longer you spend on something and the more deeply immersed you get in something, the less you realise you know. And so for me, probably one of those dawning realities that in the most recent years, I found I couldn't ignore any longer, that threatened to really undermine the very premise of a business called Board Intelligence and the work that we did. The dawning reality was that our most successful clients, by a country mile, were the ones whose decision-making centre of gravity was as far away from the boardroom as possible. It shouldn't have taken me quite so long to realise this, because right in the early days of board intelligence, probably about 12 something plus years ago, this was pointed out to me very clearly. But it was inconvenient, so I kind of ignored it. So I was pitching to Sir John Timpson, the father of James Timpson, who runs the shoe menders, the cobblers and key cutters that we all know and use. And he came into our boardroom and let us pitch to him. Our boardroom back then was a tiny little attic room in a St James's townhouse, and this is a big burly fellow. He kind of filled the space, and we were thrilled to have this opportunity. So we had this pitch ready for him. It was a pitch that had worked very well for us in the past, getting us into the boardrooms of National Grid, Citigroup, Bank of New York Mellon, all about how we could help those boards, and in this case Sir John Timpson, to get more value out of his board. So he very politely sat there and let us work through this. And we got to about 10 minutes in, and he just couldn't bear it any longer. And he held his hand up like he was trying to stop the oncoming traffic. And he said, "I'll stop you there. I don't need a better board. The important decisions in my organisation are not made in my boardroom." And what he went on to explain was a way of working that's often called upside down governance. And the basic premise of upside down governance, particularly in his case, was that the most important factor for their success was their ability to get customers back through the door enthusiastically, time and time again. And who has the best grasp on the customer? Who has the most data points on the customer? Well, the people in the front line, the people in the shops. And certainly least handle on the customer, people in the boardroom, right? So it was the job of the board to empower, train, and support management. And it was management's job to empower, train, and support the frontline shop workers to act in the best interest of their customers, and to take really good, rapid decisions. But as I say, this was kind of inconvenient when you set up a business called Board Intelligence, and your whole reason for being is to help boards work smarter, faster, better. So we shut down this message and cracked on with what we were doing, and we built a successful company, right? So we have today a few thousand clients who subscribe to our software platform, lots of big household names, as well as smaller organizations, good cross-section. And we do hopefully really good work for these boards, helping them, work smarter, be more productive, really tap into the collective brain power of the brains around the boardroom table, and knock over all of the many obstacles in their path. Now, we don't specialize in the people piece. That's where Alice is essential, getting the right people around the table. But what we do is then remove the obstacles that can get in the way of the board having the conversations that matter and such like. And as I say, we built a successful business. We were valued at a few $100 million in our last round. The business is going well. But as I say, the dawning reality was that maybe we were focusing in the wrong place. And the reason I think this became so obvious or so hard to ignore was that the job of the board was ballooning. And Alice has spoken about this. You talked, Alice, about the board being a tough place to be, about this continuous string of black swan events, right? And we've seen this in our work, right? I mean, we all know this from reading the paper, but we would see the information flow become absolutely unwieldy and untenable. The volume of agenda items balloon. And I was sat with one of our clients. He was a new incoming chairman of a bank, just been appointed. Really important that we bond with him and that we get him on side. And he greeted me and said, pointing at his quite craggy face, he said, "This is not the face of a very old man. This is the face of a man who has spent the weekend poring over 550 pages of board papers." And as I kind of explained to him, yes, I hear you, but it was 1,000 pages. And we have reduced it down to 550 pages and broadened it out in scope and vastly improved the readability and the usefulness of the information set. But he retorted, "It's still, I can't read 550 pages this weekend and 550 pages next weekend and the one after, because they have various board meetings and committee meetings and whatnot. It's still, you may have made it less broken, it is still broken." And you look at the number of agenda items on our clients' boards, and yeah, they've grown by something like a third or so in the last couple of years. And look over the last 4 or 5 years, and you can get a sense of how out of control things have gotten in the boardroom. Back when we begun, which was just in the wake of the financial crisis, the focus was on, the number one board priority was risk and getting a real grip on risk. Then very quickly it became risk and culture. Then very quickly it was risk, culture, sustainability, and carbon footprint. Then very quickly it was risk, culture, sustainability, and now of course we've got AI, and I've probably missed out a bunch. And that's before you get to anything specific to any individual organisation and what actually matters to them. One of our clients, Keith Hamill, he at the time was board member at EasyJet, and he said, I feel like I need a horizontal board agenda for all of my many number one board priorities. And another client, Dom Barton, he's chair at Rio, he said, the big risk is when the board falls into the doom loop where the board is just busy being busy. And this is what we were seeing an awful lot. So yes, I would like to say, and I hope you believe me, and I hope our clients feel it, that the impact of the work at Board Intelligence was making a massive difference. But it wasn't enough, right? It was sort of diminishing returns. So we started to look more carefully at what was it that our clients were doing differently. The minority whose boards were not deluged with this sort of flood, what was going on there? And how were those boards seemingly able to discharge more business upstream, giving the board a more manageable, right-sized job for the amount of time and capability they had. And we started to research this. We wrote a book about it, actually. So if anyone's interested in learning more, it's Collective Intelligence, How to Build a Business That is Smarter Than You. And what we found was that those organizations, the ones that were not drowning, the ones whose boards had a fighting chance of doing a good job, they were really strong in 3 areas. Their management teams were really strong in 3 areas. And those 3 areas were really, really extraordinary critical thinking skills that were plain to see. A management team who was really good at pulling signal from the noise, forming judgments about the situation they were in. So really strong critical thinking skills, rigor. Secondly, excellent communication skills, able to communicate that thinking, right? It's no good having great thinking if you can't communicate it. With this on the vine. But even more important, if you're going to discharge more authority upstream, you need a management team who can communicate to evidence accountability, right? Sort of accountable freedom. So you can't, the kind of corollary to delegation is accountability, and you need to be able to communicate well to display that. And then thirdly, so after, you need to be really good at critical thinking, really good communication skills, and really, really focused and aligned on what matters most. Because for a board to let out more rope, to give more authority upstream to management, and to reduce the flow into the boardroom, they need confidence that management's efforts and decision-making time will be spent on furthering that pursuit of the North Star, and it will all be directed in the right way. Okay, so confident that with that freedom, the efforts will be channeled correctly. So you need those 3 things. And then we thought, well, let's take a look at what most boards see, right? And this, by the way, is where you guys come in, right? If you're going to help a board to do less and delegate more, what does the board need to see, and what does the board see? So what the board sees currently, if you think, where does the board form a view of management? Where does the board form its view of management's competency at critical thinking, communication, and focus? This is obviously being done, by most boards intuitively, not explicitly, right? They don't sit there with the board intelligence model necessarily, but they're doing this in the back of their minds. And this is the processing that's forming this overall judgment that we need to keep a tight grip on things, or that we can let out more rope. So what they're seeing is disproportionately formed by a really small set of data points that they have on management. So the board has, as Alice said, very few meetings a year in which they form these views. And so a lot of it's being formed by the board papers and by the presentations that you deliver to your board in those board meetings, which is a really, really tiny data point. And I'm going to guess many of you would not feel that your last board paper or board presentation was a fully representative reflection of you and your capabilities. But that's all they've got to go on. So when you look at the board papers and you look at the board presentations, what do you see? So first of all, are they stuffed full of really crisp, rigorous critical thinking? No. Mostly what you see is an absolute dump of data huge volume of data in the spirit of transparency. Here's all the data you could ever wish for, and not a lot of so what, not a lot of signal from the noise, right? And not a lot of putting your neck on the line and saying, what do I think? In fact, people tend to think they're not supposed to say what they think. It's, you know, it's supposed to be somehow objective, a bit like we're taught at school, you know, don't say I. But actually, they want to hear what you think, because, you know, right now we haven't delegated everything to the robots, and so they want to know what you personally think this stuff means. And it's not fact, it's opinion, it's judgment, and they need to see you exercise and display that. So, you know, typically you get a lot of information, a lot of facts, you don't get a lot of so what, and a lot of opinion and judgment and what it means. Secondly, communication. We all know these phrases crop up a lot around any board or exec deck, which is, you know, it's really hard to find needles in haystacks. It's very hard to extract the key messages, like drinking water from a fire hose. You know, so in many ways, as a communication exercise, it's simply too much, and it's not super concise. It's not, you know, it's often not clear enough. It's often also extremely dry and just hard to get through. It's not a zippy, slick communication exercise. And then thirdly, it's the question of, is it focused on what matters most? Again, typically board decks are a function of habit and convention. Here's the information set that's always gone to the board. Here you go. And maybe it's the time of the year where we always do X, Y, or Z. Here you go. Rather than, here is what matters most right now. Here is what matters most, also thinking to the future. And then here is my information set, fully, ruthlessly aligned to what we all believe matters most in pursuit of that North Star. I've read an awful lot of board decks, and at the end of it, I really couldn't tell you what the goals and ambitions of the organization are, what the things that really matter are right now. I can tell you a lot of stuff, but I couldn't tell you from all of that stuff what is really, really important right now in pursuit of those goals. So what boards see is undermining management's ability to demonstrate critical thinking, good communication skills, and focus. So then it's maybe not such a surprise that boards end up keeping the reins much tighter, right, and giving out less rope. And then in doing so, you know, creating this really quite unworkable situation where far too much is reserved for the board, and they're on something of a hiding to nothing. So I'm going to leave you with a quote and a question. The quote is from our chairman, a woman called Anne Hyatt. She was for about a decade chief of staff to Jeff Bezos during the first 10 years of Amazon's extraordinary journey. Or I think she joined after about 2 or 3 years into that journey, but the really exciting hockey stick bit of that journey. And then she went from being chief of staff to Jeff Bezos for a decade to being chief of staff for Eric Schmidt at Google. And this is a quote from her. I've scribbled it down in my handwriting, which my husband will tell you is appalling. So I can see if I can even read it. But she says, "It is a myth that the singular genius of these larger-than-life founders has made these organizations so successful. But what they have done differently, and the real source of their genius, is that they have thought harder about how to help others to think well. And that is why they have been as successful as they are." So I guess the question for you is, right now, when you think about your management team, you think about your peers, and you think about their direct reports, how would you today score their thinking ability, critical thinking ability, and ability to showcase that, right? You might think they're quite good thinkers privately, but how good are they today at showcasing their critical thinking capability and at communicating it really clearly? And how focused and aligned is your management team and their direct reports on what it is that matters most and what the North Star of your organization is? How would you score them today? And what could you do to help build out each of those competencies and showcase that to the board? Because if you can do that, you will achieve 3 things. Firstly, you will give your board the context from which to delegate much, much more, right? Giving you, secondly, whatever is then reserved for the board, those few matters that do still go to the board, they will have a really strong fighting chance of doing a great job of, partly because they're trying to discharge a much more reasonable amount of stuff, but also because you'll be supporting them with really great board papers and all of the thinking and information to support those conversations. And thirdly, most importantly, you'll be creating the context for an organization that can get stuff done so much faster, right? And really help to free it from the chokehold of a board that reserves far too much decision-making authority for itself. Everything I've just said about the board also true for the executive committee, right? So if you want an organization that really does have disciplined entrepreneurialism, accountable freedom, and the ability to move fast and make things, how can you create the context for that federated decision-making model of responsible delegation? There we go. That's all from me right now. But yeah, Richard, over to you for how we now maybe have questions or breakouts.
Well, I think we'll just stay in the round because you cover such a lot there, both of you. Thank you, Alice and Jen, ever so much. There's a lot of substance, load of questions answered, lots of tips and techniques as well. Please do raise your hand or just come in for questions, and I'll get one going. So please do, as I say, come in. But Jen and Alice, you have covered this. I'm not saying you haven't for a second, but how can you and the HR team work well with the board was one of our questions. If you were to see one or two things more, what would you go for in terms of what you see and how CPOs and HR teams engage with the board? What would you particularly prioritise?
Alice, do you want
You good?
Okay.
You good?
I'm happy to otherwise. Okay, so maybe two different things. One is how you represent yourself in the boardroom, and then perhaps separately how you create the context for everybody to engage in that way with the board in your capacity as chief, obviously learning and culture officer to some extent. So for yourself, I would say, the next time you are asked to report to the board, the way that, okay, so I talked about building these competencies of critical thinking, communication, and focus. We call this model the question-driven, or whether we call our approach the question-driven insight principle. Because for us, probably the simplest tool that you can use to sharpen up all three of these disciplines is through learning how to deploy questions and questioning better. So the next time you report to your board, spend way more time thinking, what are the critical questions right now that my board need insight into? The really critical questions that if I were in their shoes, I would want the insights to. And give you examples of those in a bit if anyone's interested. And then how can I frame my communication to the board in answer to those questions quite explicitly and really pull out, not just share the data in answer to the questions, but pull out the so what and make sure those questions are objectively so clearly focused on what matters most. Right. So I would engage in yes, I'd say thinking really hard about what are the questions that matter most. In fact, there's a great Einstein quote. He says, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would spend the first 55 minutes isolating the proper question to answer. Because once I've figured out the real question, I can solve it in 5 minutes. So I'd say, yeah, think about the questions and frame your response to the board in answer to those questions and make the questions quite explicit. Your board will find that really compelling. It always is, right? Our minds start whirring when we see questions. You kind of want to know what the answer are. And it'll force you to think about insights. And then secondly, how can you build that out as a culture for the rest of your organization, building a questioning culture? But I'd say start by thinking about maybe where you would score your organization, the sort of most senior down to middle management, perhaps to start with, in terms of critical thinking, communication, and focus. Where's the starting point? Where does the focus of the change or transformation that you need, where does that need to be focused? Is it on any one or three of those competencies? And then there's a whole ton of stuff I could share galore about the different tools one can use to build out each of those competencies at scale across an organization.
Thanks, Jen. Alice?
I was going to, yeah, lovely. I was going to let you go first. That's lovely. Maybe given, that's such a great answer, if I maybe take it right down to some very practical things that you could do to answer your question, Richard. One is, think about the key players in the board and just get to know them well personally. Personal relationships are a huge part of this sort of story. And if I think about the things that we tend to work on, the company secretary with the chair is the person usually setting the agenda, setting the timing, setting the calendar, and that's such a important place, an important driver of what gets done well, what gets done too fast and hurriedly, and what doesn't. And they're often hugely powerful people, depending again on your construct, but getting to know obviously the chair, but also the company secretary and their team, and making sure that your voice is heard when those decisions are made about what to put when and where and how, and what external speakers you want, and I just think getting your voice into that in a powerful way is good. And similarly, really getting to know the board members individually, and understanding their perspectives and points of view, and what they might ask questions on, what they might want to know. Nothing really beats it if you're going to be an effective sort of participant in the board, is to have got to know them personally, so there's that trust, but also understand if they have a particular set of experiences which are going to make them ask about data or diversity or whatever it might be, so that you know that as a person. That'll help you be more successful, help you make the right calls with your teams and the people around you to make best use of the time.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you both. Off the back of that, Caroline, who's at home suffering from a cold, but is still on the call. So thanks, Caroline. Great question from her. What are the common complaints of boards about HR's interactions? This is a bid to make yourself popular. Go for it.
I mean, as I'm still off mute, I think I perhaps wouldn't separate HR from others. In my experience, it's the things that Jen was sort of talking about. That the papers are too long, they're not synthesized, they're not clear. There's not the 2 or 3 points that we need to really understand today. The things that are different from the last board paper that we saw. Board members are busy; they have plenty of other things to be doing. And to Jen was saying, you don't want to spend your weekend reading 500 pages, and we hear that every single time. And every board I've ever worked in, about pretty much every inputting executive, HR, also COO, strategy, transformation, it's too much. So the things that I think Jen and I've both been talking about is, what is the synthesis, what is the message? If you can level up and help the chair run a meeting which is important and impactful and get stuff done, you'll be hugely popular. I think HR is a pivotal role and becoming increasingly more important in that whole debate, and chairs are looking to see HRs to help them solve that across the board.
Yeah, and I probably just add that I think there's been, again, as with all things in life, you can have too much of a good thing. And over the last few years, a lot of focus on KPIs and data. And again, I think probably drawing from again, a bit of the Amazon playbook, data-driven decision making, all that stuff's great. I'm not going to poo-poo data, but you can have too much of anything, and data without the insight isn't that useful. What you often see for an HR report is a set of KPIs. Here's a set of KPIs about open positions, maybe some engagement survey feedback, maybe some diversity stats, and you get this kind of sheet of KPIs. And what that does is says that yes, we captured data, which is good. A bit of a hygiene factor is in place, not a bad thing. But what it doesn't do is evidence your leadership chops, right? So that comes from explicitly asking and answering the question proactively for the board. So what? And what are we going to do about it? And what's this got to do with where we're trying to get to? Right. So yes, here's my data, but it quickly becomes wallpaper when it's not reviewed quickly. And I suppose, as with, again, every C-suite function, from the the CFO can be chief bookkeeper or kind of deputy chief exec. The CHRO is either chief people officer, really driving the human capability and capacity of the organization, or it's the person who makes sure payroll gets paid, right? And demonstrating which one of those you are, strategic or operational or both, which is really what one is, comes from your ability to go, here's the data and here's what it means, here's why it matters, and here's what we're going to do about it.
Thanks both. Great answers. People on the call, network members, what would you like to ask? What points would you like to make? What's the relationship that you have with your board, and are there things that you'd like to improve, or perhaps not? Perhaps you have a great relationship with your board, in which case, tell us more, because we'd love to learn from you. So after this session, perhaps another question might be, how would you like to re-energize your relationship with the board? Feel free to come in or just raise your hand. Don't need to, just
Yeah, or if there's anything we've said that you wildly disagree with, go for it. Because, yeah, I mean, everything gets simplified for these conversations, doesn't it? And, I would subscribe to 90% of what I've said and probably 10% exaggeration. So, feel free to chip away and challenge if there's anything. Go for it, Heidi.
How would you approach a conversation with the board about their own personal development?
Ooh, great question, Heidi.
Yeah. Such a good, all I'm going to say is this is one of the reasons that we once upon a time did board evaluation. We are looking more at those kind of things again these days. But one of the reasons we stopped early on, having done a few quite big, we did John Lewis Partnership, did Investment Association, did a bunch of really great board evaluations. But I personally, maybe I was just too young at the time, I found it so incredibly stressful and difficult delivering tough love and feedback to a cohort who hadn't grown up with that kind of way of working, right? So we've all grown up with it. You get used to it. I personally don't enjoy it very much. I know it's good for me, but I always find it a little bit stinging and a little bit, hard to swallow the negative feedback, right? That we all grow from. It's good for us. But at least I've had, my entire career of getting used to that. Whereas a lot of these, mostly guys, some girls now too, in their late 50s, early 60s, they didn't have that in their formative years. It wasn't necessarily such part of the just suck it up culture we have to, that we have these days. And so delivering feedback to a chair in their early 60s who's pretty confident about their capability, the negative feedback that was important to hear without too much sugaring of the pill. I personally found that really hard, and so stopped doing it actually. Anyway, but over to Alice.
Your own personal development in terms of that, asking the board's advice on it. Is that
I think in reality, everyone's an HR expert, and sometimes, there might be a presentation that gets delivered, and I get challenged by the board on something. So it could be something to do with continuous performance management, and they keep talking to me about appraisals, for example. And I keep saying, no, we're not doing appraisals, we're doing continuous performance management, so it's just not a one-off event.
Yeah.
But they're fixated on that, for example. And I suppose, like I say, everyone feels that they're an HR expert in everything. And I suppose there's an element of a number of our board members sit on numerous boards as well, but I think there needs to be a bit of personal development or a bit of kind of improved insights in a number of different areas as well.
Sorry, I so misinterpreted and talked about how you deliver the board the news of their personal development requirements. Sorry, over to you, Alice.
No problem. There's lots of different angles on it, aren't there? In that instance, it feels like there's a bit of level setting in the board about what you're talking about. So you could do that. I don't know if you've got any sort of advisors or speakers or consultants who'd come in and sort of help you, or whether you could do it yourself. But it seems like the board and you need to agree on what you're talking about. And so whether that's just looking at your HR strategy and asking for some, deep dive time to just get comfortable with what we mean, what our performance management system is and what the terms are that you're using and why, which might require a bit of a step back. Things have changed. To Jen's point, life is different in the world now. This is how we do it. This is what I mean by these terms. This is what we're doing in this business. So I think, taking a step back, board needs to learn and needs to grow and understand and come with you on these sorts of journeys. So you need to make time to have that. And it may be hard for you always to be the one telling them over and over again if you feel like you've said it and they haven't heard it. But it's an education piece and a level setting of language about what you're actually doing. There's probably two pieces to it that one of those should work. And again, back to CEO chair. Your CEO should support you in that. The co-sec could, and the chair should support you to have that conversation in the round in the board. If we're going to make progress, we need to, get some of these things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. And Sam, welcome. For Headspace Network members, Sam's speaking at our next event on the 26th of November. Sam, big thanks for that. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Alice and Jennifer. Great session. I had a question, a bit of more of a tricky one, actually, and just wondering if you had any advice when, as a chief people officer, you're working with the board, but you perhaps have some genuine concerns that are of risk to the organisation. You've raised it with the CEO, and the CEO is perhaps ignoring that or not taking action. So I'm not talking about the day-to-day, but it could be around culture, behaviour, various things. And it's a really tricky one because obviously, you're effectively telling tales above the CEO. But just wondering if you had any advice on how to navigate that sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it quite a lot actually. The CEO succession issue. There's often triggers for that which are not pleasing. Unsavoury. Lots of things that can go on. So CHRO is in a unique position because you are effectively working for the CEO. But you're also accountable for the role being governed effectively and appropriately. So in those situations, that's a moment of governance testing for you and for the organisation. And the only way to do that, if you've tried your CEO angle, is to go to the board and to take ideally the chair, or you could go to non-gov chair, or you could go to a friendly board member, depending on your relationship set. But ideally, you should raise a question with the chair. And depending how serious the issues are, maybe they're not. But there is, the onus is on you, if you know something that's going on, for you to make sure you go through the proper processes and it gets raised to the board, if you're that worried about it.
Yeah.
You may not be. I'm in serious land of things that.
No, I think I'm talking about those serious issues that you just feel you're not going to get traction on, and they are potentially a risk to the organisation.
Then follow your gut as well. But the other thing I'd say, you need to do something about it.
I think so. I think two things. One that I think is a theoretical answer, and one is the one of what I would do in your shoes. So the theoretical answer, so we make a big part of our work has been over many years about how to create more of a candid, a context for more candidness between management and the board, right? And one of the ways we do that is by normalizing a question that every performance report should respond to directly, explicitly, which is what's not going well and what's keeping me up at night, right? And when you know that question is routinely asked and answered, it does create less shock, less, when you respond to those questions. In fact, it creates more conspicuousness when those two questions are not asked and answered, because people wonder where's your, where's that gone? What is it that's so terrible right now that you don't feel able to tell us what's wrong? And it becomes quite understood within the culture of the organisation that if you can't articulate at any point in time what's not going well or what's keeping you awake at night, it's because you don't have a handle on your part of the business, because business is never plain sailing. That's my theoretical answer. If you were talking about anyone other than the chief executive, totally honestly, I would look for another job. I think the idea of blowing the whistle on the chief executive, I'd like to be a braver person than I am. And I think, if I worked for an organisation like the NHS, or if I worked for an organisation where I felt there was, real harm to come to innocent, vulnerable people, if I kept quiet, then I'd like to think I would speak out. Otherwise, if that weren't the case, I think I'd go and look for another job.
Interesting. I think that's the path I took. Unfortunately, but it did beg the question as to, should you be braver? Should you? It wasn't that I didn't raise issues, but I felt compromised, and I felt that was the only option.
Blowing the whistle on the chief exec is a really tough gig. If the chairman has, I suppose this is also where exit interviews come in, isn't it? And I suppose I'd also look to is this being outed in other exit interviews? Is there a mechanism the board has for seeing a distillation of the key points coming out in exit interviews? That could help. But really, it's a nuclear option, isn't it? Going over the head of the chief executive.
Thank you. Really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And Sarah.
Hi, sorry, I was a bit late to this. So I was just curious that you talked about boards going out and talking to the business more, because I think, our board do not engage with our business at all in my experience. So have you seen that changing, where boards are directly going out more to talk to their people, and what's the benefit and what impact have you seen of that? Because it sounds like a really good idea to me, but I haven't seen much of that.
So I think I said that. So I think there's a few gradations of it, and I think big picture, yes, I think it's increasing. UK, I think, as I mentioned, UK FTSE governance requirements require somebody on the board to have a kind of direct line into employees, which is a signal of things that are being cared about and looked at in the governance sort of environment, making sure the board is in touch with the employees. And very practically, what I see a lot of, I'm in with a board today actually, and what they're doing a lot of, they're talking about them. Two of the board members are joining the graduates onboarding day, spending a whole day with the new graduate joiners. There's another two who do monthly roundtables with up and coming diverse talent, just to get to know them. They make sure that the big teams come into the board to present, even if they're not all speaking. They just get to know them. They introduce themselves. They say what are they working on, and it's a thing that's brought up frequently. And I see that quite a lot. What are we doing to get around places? And they have an organised site visit program as well. They go around different places and look and see and learn and understand some of the things that are happening in the business. So I think that is quite typical in the boards that I'm working with, and I would probably say it's good practice when I'm doing board review work to have a strand of that. It's appropriate and helpful. The impact being you're better able to make decisions once you've seen a little bit of the colour, culture, the texture of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I'm really surprised by your data actually, Alice, where you had that chart, that bar chart showing, I think it was the second bar chart showing the number of boards that think they should have, they should attend the odd town hall, that they should this, that, and the other. I was really surprised that it wasn't kind of universal. I mean, that everyone doesn't think they ought to do those things. I'm not saying that they would necessarily then get around to doing all of those things, but the idea that they felt they should not do those things is peculiar.
Yeah, some of them don't, to be fair. I mean, there's
And I think it's, again, if you take the view that the job of the board is to take decisions, then yes, they're terribly busy taking decisions, like, leave them alone. But if you take the view that the job of the board is to make sure that the management team and all of the layers below are firing on all cylinders, really humming, really focused and aligned about what matters most, capable of taking really excellent decisions, doing things the right way, then kind of there's nothing else that matters other than how well plugged in they are to sensing and feeling how the organization is functioning. Because if you take the view that it's the organization, it's the exec and management team who need to take the big important decisions and govern in the right way, then anything and everything you can do to get a feel for that is going to be super important. At the same time, I do think the scale of the challenge is worth acknowledging. So if you work for a large multinational, how do you then balance essentially anecdotal evidence from 10 to 20 conversations with people in the workforce that maybe represent 20,000 or 100,000 individuals scattered around the world? There's obviously a danger that you draw too much from very anecdotal inputs. But I think spending time thinking how to crack that is really important. And relying purely on the information that comes up through the flow of management is going to make you a little vulnerable.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you, Alice. Thanks for the question, Sarah. Thanks to all network members for coming along. Do hope that was useful. I found it absolutely fascinating. Loads of suggestions, loads of ideas. Do leave us some feedback, and we'll see you in a network event again very soon. Alice and Jen, thank you so much again. Much appreciated.
Thank you.